basically there, Lisa mentioned it, we talk about business strategy, we talk about global mobility, how it all plays together, and I think like they're really, you've seen global mobility evolve over a very long time, and I think like that also gives you a very good perspective to like what's ahead. But before we dive in, wanted to quickly hand over for an intro so that everyone knows who they are dealing with now.
Hello, I'm Lisa Eggershausen, and I'm currently Global Mobility and Immigration Manager with Foot Locker. So, love the trend of sneakers as workwear. I think it's been great since the pandemic. I have been in global mobility about 25 years. I've been with relocation management companies, with one of the big four doing the tax side, and then with some companies on the corporate side. I've been with very big manufacturing company with a massive program. I've been with mid-size, and I'm currently with a medium to small size program. I was a team of one until last year. I now have a U.S. immigration specialist, which is a lifesaver. But I really enjoy global mobility. I love what I do. I love the people that I get to work with. And I think all the experience has helped to see there's different ways of doing things, there's different options. How can we make this work?
Good. Hello, everyone. I'm Don Juris. I'm the Global Benefits and Mobility Lead for SumUp. I used to work at Wayfair. Prior to that, I think the last time I was on the stage with Localize, it was actually still while I was with Wayfair. I'm grateful that I've got Angela Franco here on the team who thankfully is taking a lot of that type of case management and a lot of the process and operational work off of my hands, which helps quite a lot. My background, I've been involved in some way, shape, or form with global mobility for about 35 years, going all the way back to 1990, my first international assignment in Taiwan. So I'm one of those senior executives back in the day from the early morning conversation who moved around the world in very specific roles for almost 20 years doing that, 15 international moves over time. And so have a lot of the user experience, and at one point backed into global mobility by simply, they came to me and said, can you run this instead of given all the experience that you've had on the other side of it? So that's kind of how I ended up on the leadership side of global mobility.
Yeah. It's always fascinating for me as well to see like how do people end up in global mobility, and I think like very, very often, because it's not something that you specifically study and like then know when you're 18, okay, like I always wanted to be in global mobility, and it's a fascinating industry. It's like fascinating people in there, and I think like often the passion of like having seen some of the pain, really like knowing what it means, but also what incredible benefit it can have. But that just as a side note. One question to start with, and a question that we've been discussing a lot, the position of global mobility in a company, how it's evolving. Where was it sitting in the past? Where is it sitting today? Where might it sit in the future? So if you could just give us a bit of a view of like right now in your current work setup, where does it sit? But also what have you seen? Like what's the spectrum and where is it moving?
So I sit under Global Total Rewards, and my direct manager is actually head of North American benefits. So honestly, we have very little in common in terms of our roles. But she has managed global mobility for some time, and she understands it, and it made the most sense. And I've seen that in a lot of companies, especially if you don't have a large dedicated mobility or people mobility teams. So it can work no matter where you sit. If you're in a massive team with regional and long-term assignment versus one-way transfer specialties and so on, you're still partnering with many different people across an organization, different roles like talent acquisition and payroll and all the different things. If it's if you're just in a smaller team, it's kind of the same. So I don't know that there's a perfect answer. I've been flexible with a lot of different things.
I'd say the same thing. I sit under Total Rewards as well, but because I have dual portfolio, I suspect it's really because the comp and benefits side of that really puts me in that part of the organization. Is there a lot of commonality? No, I don't think so between the two, but it happens to be where you get individual people like myself that may have a expertise in a couple of different places, and so they just sort of stuff it there. The one problem with, and I think we all face it, is this feeling of being a misfit. Where do you sit in? When we talk about strategy in particular, how do you leverage this fact that we don't fit necessarily anywhere, but we have a huge amount of interaction with a whole range of parts of the organization, and that makes it really, really difficult to be able to get your get leadership attention if you're because they only want to know, generally speaking, when something goes wrong. That's when you usually get a lot of attention, or as we're about to talk about, where you can really truly infuse yourself into the organization, and it's really, really difficult given the nature of what we do.
Maybe a quick add-on question there, tying it to what we've heard from the BCG study, and like now that seemingly like global mobility becomes a more and more like top of mind, or like something that organizations and like senior leadership care about. Have you seen that as well, or is it something where like, yeah, over the last like 20 years maybe a bit, but like kind of like nothing really changes?
I would say it's been trending in and out, and I've had more senior leadership attention in the last year based on some strategic business decisions. So yes, when these needs arise, suddenly they go, do we have someone who knows about these questions? And you go,
Yes.
hi. Yeah, and then sometimes it's more business as usual, and it gets a little bit less attention.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I think one of the things that I find important to be able to put yourself in a position to be part of that strategic conversation is you've got to get the basics right? You've got to get your day-to-day activity right. You've got to be able to process and support for a visa. You've got to be able to support a relocation from point A to point B without a whole lot of trouble. And that's where in today's world where we're not getting any more people to support the mobility function. That budget itself is being tightened over time. And so you are relying on platforms like Localize, like Remote, like others, and I think that's probably one of the only solutions in that tech side to be able to help manage the volume that we're talking about. And that then alleviates the pressure on that day-to-day reactionary emergency type of activity that you end up spending your time on. And that gives you the opportunity then to try and infuse yourself from a more strategic point of view. But yeah, I think it does trend in and out depending on what decisions the companies need to make and what stage they are in their development.
Yeah. No, that's a super good point. And also follow up there. In both cases, like you are involved in making bigger strategic moves possible, and like also being involved in like certain projects. Can you maybe talk a little bit about like recent things as far as possible, recent projects and topics that you've been involved in? What has been top of mind this year?
So I've definitely seen a focus, and I know from speaking with some other friends and colleagues that there's a sense of returning a focus to core businesses, core markets, looking a little bit more at consolidating and doing well what our basics are. And in my experience, definitely less of a focus on expansion globally. So some of what I've been asked for has actually been help to evaluate markets that we're leaving, and how do we work with the folks who've been relocated there or on assignment there. And the good thing is that I've built some relationships where I'm at now and gotten some visibility, and was brought in early enough to say, let's talk about options. And does this person have a role in the Netherlands, in the UK, in the US, versus all that time and the relationship built and the expertise, and are we risking losing that? So that's been the trend that I've seen most strongly this year.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that the one thing that's the hangover from the pandemic that's still happening, which is as a lot of companies are going to 5 days a week, they're trying to co-locate people into offices. And I think there's a little bit of that still happening. And so there's a little bit of activity where we're being asked to say, hey, where's the most or the fastest place where we can do it, in terms of visa processing, et cetera. And it tends not to be Germany, and it tends not to be the UK either because of the cost associated with that. So, but that hangover on top of going back to sort of that core, either global expansion or how do we support the main activities of the business, that's really what's been being driven the last couple of, I'd say the last year or so, last 2 years.
And what are the teams that you've interacted with? And like maybe also there, especially if you not only look at like the last years, but also maybe really like looking back at your whole career, like what was maybe the most unexpected team that you had to collaborate with within the organization, and why?
So again, always HR, talent acquisition, and so on. I've worked a lot in one role with mergers and acquisitions. And the good thing was that they were aware that they needed help. And we had these standing strategy calls, and they would say, this is confidential, nothing can be released for 12 weeks. But we would do all of the background planning that when that announcement went live, that team was relocated to headquarters in Palo Alto in 5 days. 10 or 12 people at a time. So I think they had a real competitive advantage there because of that approach to it, rather than trying to react after, they had acquired this company or something. So.
Yeah, I'd back that up. Most of my career was acquisition integration. So that's the reason for a lot of the moves that I did for companies like AT&T and GE Capital, was simply that we were getting into new markets. If you go back to the 90s when the wall came down, the Soviet Union disintegrated, we had all kinds of opportunities suddenly in places like China that didn't exist in the 80s. And the fastest way in is to acquire somebody or grab somebody off of privatization, which is what happened in a lot of the cases in Eastern Europe. And they needed people to go to those places to be able to help say, right, okay, they've got a different system for everything, from finance to HR systems to whatever. In some cases, my first few jobs, it was all faxes and massive satellite phones, and we only got email like the third assignment in. But that was the type of activity that we were doing a lot back then. I think it's changed somewhat now. I think probably not surprised, but the one that has the most concern is a lot of our tax organization, where given the compliance issues we're seeing with everything from permanent establishments, workations, remote work, all of that is now sort of kicking out a lot of this issue that tax is suddenly stepping up and going, hold on a minute. We need to start talking this through. And particularly, as I think Kelly this morning had mentioned, the US is where they tend to be a lot more restrictive, simply because there is a lot of focus on US companies expanding into various parts of the world, and tax opportunities for local governments or country governments to try and find some extra revenue.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Thank you. A lot of the things that we've discussed is just around like the constant change, different counterparts to interact with, etc. So like global mobility is a very dynamic field, and of course, like when you build a career, you need to like stay on top of things and like make sure that you continue moving with the change. How do you best do that? And like what are things where you've seen, okay, like this has been the most interesting time, but like this is also then of course like challenging to like constantly dive into a new topic?
I enjoy that. I think I would be bored if I worked in a job that was the same every day. I know I would be. It's been this long. I know what I'm doing. I remember hiring someone once who came from an HR policy background to be a relocation consultant, and we thought she'd be great. And after a week, she came and looked at me and said, "Are you all crazy?" She said, "I never have any idea what my day is going to look like. I can't plan. It was not for her. And she found out after a week. That was great. She went, into a job that had a calendar and a plan and worked that way. I've learned from the people around me. I definitely find that the people in global mobility are problem solvers, Lorna said, right? They're connectors. I made notes so that I would remember some of these things, because I take things back from, things like this. People who anticipate and plan. If you need an event or a project managed, it doesn't even have to be global mobility, but a global mobility person, they have that mindset. They think through, I want this to happen, what do I need to do? What do I do if that doesn't work? What's plan B and C? And I've found that, across countries, across industries. So learning from people, talking to them. I mentioned that, I've been part of very small programs, very large programs. There's many different ways to do what we do. And weighing those risks and benefits and, figuring out ways to do it. I keep up by events like this. I usually take notes on my phone. I took these so I could see them up here. I keep up by following great sources of information, on LinkedIn and from different platforms. I lean very heavily on my partners, especially in a role like I'm in now, and say, look, I need updates on this country. I need updates on the U.S. immigration. My goodness, the changes in the is the budget going to pass or not this time? All of those things. I said, I need you to tell me what's going on so that I know when to act or when to take news back. I have colleagues and friends in the industry. We share information, and I'm happy to do that with those of you here, give and get. What are you doing about this? Have you seen that? I've definitely found that leadership pays more attention when I say that I already did my homework. Other retail companies are doing this, this, and this. When they ask me, what should we do? I say, well, here are my recommendations. Here's what others are doing. Let's weigh that. That carries more weight than just saying, I think this. Of course, it's normal, right? When there's some benchmarking, when there's some comparison. And I loved, I think it was Kelly's idea for AI, to say, use AI to help keep up with trends and updates and things, right? There's so much information out there. Like I said, I lean on my partners now. When she mentioned that for AI, I was like, that could be interesting. I've done Google alerts when I was creating some policies that weren't very common yet, just to see what else was out there and what people might be posting. But definitely worth making time for it. It can be really easy to worry about the day-to-day and the function and keeping things moving. I often make it like my first 10 minutes or my last 10 minutes. First 10 minutes, you're fresh, you get through it fast, keep up to date. The last 10, sometimes I'm done thinking, I'm done trying to figure out answers, but I can read through some updates and flag ones that I need to pay attention to. So.
Yeah, I'd say each other. I would agree with all of that. I think industry roundtables where we have in Berlin at least one call every first Friday of the month where we get other colleagues or peers that we've seen in the industry get together and have discussions about a subject. And we're not competitors. It was said in the last panel. We're really here to learn from each other at places like this, at roundtables, at wherever you can. Learn from each other. You guys have all had great experiences. Some are going to be very unique that we can benefit from everyone's knowledge and kind of combining that to help improve mobility as a role overall and strengthen it across all our companies.
Yeah, definitely. And also one thing that you mentioned now is like it's a job where there's a lot of changes, a lot of fires to be solved, different problems being thrown at you. And I think like also now, especially in the last years, the risk factor has been one that's been increasing. Compliance, also with like labor laws, they change. I think like right now in the political environment, governments do change their opinion. And I think like then we need to work with it because frankly, I think like every country needs some kind of mobility. But like how do you manage the risk portion, international labor laws, compliance, because like also for companies, that can really be a bigger factor, and it's a lot of responsibility. Don, maybe you want to start.
I think compliance is one of those things where it really is company by company. When I work for SumUp, which is a regulated company, fintech, so you end up with a lot more of a focus. It's extremely difficult. We leverage platforms. Same thing is something like you for visa, for relocation. You now have a lot of that ability to support compliance in terms of A1 certificates or COCs and things. So we leverage that as best as we can. Other companies like a Wayfair, for example, which isn't as regulated, you have to work through the risk-cost equation. And you may get a leader who says, well, let's take the risk simply because the cost associated with that, the fines or whatever else, may be smaller than the cost of actually trying to comply. And so it really depends. I think that's a conversation you really do have to have with leadership and understand what their risk appetite is and then figure out ways of being able to do it. But without tech support, and this goes back to quite a few areas, without that technology support, and it's going to be very difficult. Otherwise, you're sitting on Googling everything, trying to figure it out that way, and it's hard. There's other experts to go lean on.
I totally agree with that, and without the tech tools, there's no way we could all keep up with the human piece as well. I'm going to focus a little on the personal side of it. So risk often involves talking about costs or time, and it can be fairly dry and data-based. And I've found in many situations it's really helpful to tell the story, to tell what does this mean to the business? What does this mean to this team member or to you? And sometimes it takes a while for them to come back around. I actually collect stories. Sometimes they're relevant right away, and sometimes they're not. But we had a long-term assignee, 7 or 8 years, who'd been back for 5 or 6 years, and there was that trailing tax liability. He had been tax equalized, US outbound employee, and it was highly compensated individual, of course, and so it trailed and trailed and trailed. And he got tired of working with our tax partner. And someone along the way said, fine, you can work with your private tax accountant. When I started, we were still trying to clean up his 2019 US and Canada tax returns because the tax accountant was not an expert on relocation as much as they said they were. And this is 2022, and I think it took into 2023. So it ended up taking more time and more effort on his part, and boy, did he love it when we followed up with him about documents and things, not. Not to mention the risk of costs and fines and things like that. But when we told that story, when they were considering a new assignment, and the person was saying, well, I'm not sure I want to work with a tax partner, can I work with my own? I said, we can, and here's an example of what may happen, and how would you feel about that in 5 years? You know, that was more meaningful, and I said, go talk to him if you'd like, you know, see what a fun experience that was. So sometimes telling those stories really makes a bigger impact than just, you know, of course the data is important too, yeah.
I will add to that. I think the data side of it and the storytelling associated with that data is hugely important when we talk about the strategic ability to use global mobility for certain things. And I'll give you an example of something. When we were at Wayfair, we took a look at our population in the United States in particular, and we realized that of the visa holders, and because it was a lot of technology capability that we were bringing in from India, that we had 2/3 of our population was Indian. And nothing wrong with that, but it's a costly exercise to have them brought over from India into the United States. And you've got everything from H-1Bs to the lottery that then you shunt them up to Canada and back and associated with that. And we were able to put that data in front of leadership and say, there's got to be a better way to do this. And eventually we went with we looked at Walmart, we looked at Target, we looked at other companies, Amazon, what they were doing, and they were putting in resources in India itself. Why move them? Now that was reducing my workload. Okay, I can live with that. But it was really about how do you then build up maybe a technology development center somewhere else? How do you leverage data to change the organization through mobility in some way, shape, or form? And there's now 1,000 people sitting in India for Wayfair and a much reduced cost structure based on doing that. And we even had people wanting to go back to India because they wanted to be with their grandparents. They left the US and were willing to go back for the lower salaries. And so there's ways of using data to get yourself into that strategic discussion, and that's really critical.
It's super interesting. I think also looking at how do you manage the whole complexity with it's not tangible. Risk is not tangible very often. I think now we start sometimes seeing news bubble up with okay, on the back of COVID and a lot of people working remotely, there might be some fines, but then companies say oh, but it's only the one or two very large companies, that will never happen. Then you start hearing, okay, maybe in some co-working spaces, at least that's what I heard, in some co-working spaces, they start making checks when they see that someone's not from the country, do they have an A1 certificate, etc. But it's very punctual, and I think it's something where top of mind for everyone, it's still super easy, and I think then managing the expectation then also saying, okay, 90% of the case everything goes right, but you don't want to be the 10%, and I think there it's also often, I think an individual decision by leadership, for example, how risk adverse are they, have they seen something, I think of course the factor, is it a regulated industry, but I do think there are sometimes either organizations are too strict and say, okay, we just prohibit everything because we don't want to deal with it at all, or they just don't want to invest resources because they say nothing will happen. And so I think there also the education piece where for someone working in global mobility, you're the best people to make at least an educated guess on okay, what is a good program to settle on, but how do you go by educating? I think Don, you shared the example also of putting concrete numbers in front of them, but how do you constantly advocate for that, and what are things that you've seen work really well there?
That's a big question. And technically, cross-border remote work doesn't sit under me. However, at my company, I'm the one who's had the most experience managing policies previously, so I consult heavily. And it is a big part of education, which is the same with all the risks, right? And people don't know what they don't know. Until you relocated, you probably didn't know all the things that would have to happen, right? And if you haven't moved your family across the border or, worked in another country or had to deal with taxes or visa or finding housing, you really don't have a concept of how complex that can be. And that's, in a nutshell, our job, right? Helping people understand that and helping people find ways to make that work. So with this example, it's just happening faster. And there's more people involved than before and more people raising their hands. And so the education is happening with me a little bit more like piecemeal, and when you get an opportunity, when someone asks, when a team suddenly has interest. But a lot of what we do is repetition. And it's telling the story, and it's explaining, here's what does make sense, here's what maybe does not. For us, a big example, we have a lot of Indian tech team members in the US. Most of them are on H-1B visas. Their visa is tied to their work location. They raise their hand and say, I want to go work in India for a few weeks while I'm on vacation. And the manager's like, sure, why can't they? And I said, because they jeopardize their status in the US. How important is it to you to work in the US? And they wanted that. They want their green card. They want that. It's not worth 2 weeks of vacation or 2 weeks working there, to jeopardize this. Unfortunately, that's not something we can support right now. So we're starting to, document some of those FAQs for the bigger populations and things. We still have lots of individual cases, and boy, does it get creative and complex. And having other people help spread that message is a big part of it as well. So I have a VP of HR who was a director when I started, who was relocating himself for the third time, and I got very involved because of some complexity. Well, he was one of those people who was open and curious and wanted to learn and know more, and he is one of the biggest cheerleaders for global mobility now, and he's now the VP of Global HR, which is fabulous because he goes to a meeting and they say, hey, we're moving our headquarters from New York to Florida. He goes, I think we should bring in Lisa and her team right now. And we did. And I got to talk while we're still talking about offers. And we did a survey of the people being offered relocation and said, what are you most concerned about? How often do you get to do that in global mobility? Ask someone their concerns before you start relocating them. And we have a large enough pool that it's really gotten executives' attention. We're bringing in our ERG groups to address some things. We're bringing in partners to address some things. We're working with the teams. And it's one of those moments. But it was time, it was years, it was relationships. Sometimes it's just one-on-one and personal. But having other people to help you spread that message and get that visibility. And then you can talk about, here are the risks, here are the pros and cons of the approach that we're talking about, and make much better decisions.
Yeah, I've never solved this problem. It's one of those things where individual things like the example I gave, I can go in front of somebody and say, here, this is just the most irrational thing we're doing right now. Why don't we change this? And if you can present the data and you have the right connections internally, that helps greatly. It's such a broad question. There's so many aspects of global mobility that either people don't want to talk about, and then just leave it to you, or you can push and it gets nowhere. And I've never had a situation, because again, it's where we sit and how the complexity of it. I don't know if anyone has the time or energy to be able to understand every aspect of it. And so you end up with a situation where you try to solve it in whatever ways you possibly can, and then try to sell it from time to time. A lot of it, again, is working with technology partners, but you've got to sell that too, right? Because as we talked about before, there's a cost associated with it, there's an investment in it. So I don't think there's one answer other than internal networking is huge, data is huge in terms of being able to put it in front of people, and the best I can say is good luck.
And I think like there continues to be complex, not getting easier. Well, in our last 15 minutes now, because we're also the last panel of today, we need to speak about the future, 2025. And I think like now, in the next 15 minutes, solve all the problems of everyone. No pressure. But if there's one thing, and I think like there are trends, a lot of things like have shaped the last years. If you would have to like reduce it to like one thing that everyone here in the room should really pay attention to, a trend, like an opportunity for the next years, what would it be?
The word for me is flexibility. It's a word for our employees, it's a word for how we work, it's a word for me as global mobility. I have seen the pace of change accelerate and the volume and the changes in direction and strategy, and learning to take a breath, think back to what you know from the past or what has worked or what you've learned, and then engage with what's there and present, and use those skills, use those problem-solving skills and those options to say, here's some scenarios, let's start planning a path forward. We can do great things and we can help make things better, but I don't think any of us will have the I don't think that it's going to be the case in our careers that we can learn to do things one way and figure, I've got this. This is how it's always going to be. Change, flexibility.
Yeah, I love that word, flexibility. I think we're all going to need to be as flexible as we possibly can. I would say, if you just spend your days Googling changes that are taking place or trying to figure it out that way, it's going to be extremely difficult. And I think tech is going to be a big part of what we do going forward, given the range of complexity that we're now facing. And I think without companies like Localize, Remote, and others, you're never going to be able to do it on your own. And I think leverage their knowledge, leverage they're experts in certain parts of the field, and it's really building that network. So I spent a lot of my time really going and talking to the various companies that are attempting to build those platforms. There isn't a perfect one out there. I hope you eventually build that in the one-stop shop, so we can just go to you and that's it. But I think as much as you can integrate yourself with technologies, be it AI or be it any other platforms that are there, and learn from them, that's probably the fastest and best way to understand some of the things that are coming.
Thank you. Also for the audience to get ready, I'll ask one last question and then we open up for your Q&A so that we can also get all of your questions solved. But one thing that I'm curious about, and I think like flexibility is like one part of it, but also I think like their reallocation of resources, because the example that you shared, the India example, I think like now there were ways like where companies like already spent money on global mobility. Right now, like they say, okay, like more budget people don't have, rather want to like cut it down, or like maybe for like some things like we would spend more, but generally I think like when we look at it, we need to like reallocate resources and see what we can do. And I do think, I had a conversation before where I was also sharing one example. There's interesting, if you look at like, when I did an internship in Shanghai at some point. Of course, as an intern, no one pays anything for you. It was even, like back in the days, you like figure it out, good luck. And then at the same time, like in Shanghai, you have people on very, very crazy expat packages, assignment packages, etc. And I do think they're theoretically, big packages, I think like for certain countries and like for certain individuals, you might need them because otherwise no one wants to move there. But also I do think in like some cases you can actually get away with less, because a lot of mobility, when it is talent driven, or at least you manage to align the interest of the individual with the interest of the company, you can really like shift resources, enable more people to move across borders, but like really like have more flexibility as well on the packages. So I know it's another very complicated question, but we'd love to hear your take, and maybe also there in terms of like reallocation, like what have you seen there, things that where it's really, this is maybe something that we can reduce, but like this is also an investment where you see companies like still making bets on?
I would say what I've seen is definitely a shift away from the traditional long-term assignment in a lot of cases, the kind that you were on years ago, the full expatriate package and international schools and home leave and so on. And I think it's a good thing. I think doing more streamlined packages that are available to more people, not just senior level. I think it's a good thing to support people at different levels in their career. And I get really excited to be involved with talent planning and career progression and succession planning rather than just move A to B, you know. And it's helped me to tell those stories. I know of a young woman who raised her hand for a domestic relocation store manager. There are still jobs that have to be done in person, right? And she was excited about it. She was young. They said, okay. Well, she was in that role a year or so when the company announced an expansion in a market in another country, a brand new market. And she sent a message and said, I would love to go to that country. I have dual citizenship. I know the culture. How can we make this happen? It would be good for both of us. What a great business proposition. What a great strategy. And it's been mentioned earlier today that there are more employees and more younger saying, I want to go. I want this experience. Rotational assignments where young career professionals get exposed to different aspects of the business in person and build those relationships. I think they're great. So I think that's the part of the trends that I like to see, that it's more opportunity across different levels, that it's more intentional about what do we need to develop in our people, what opportunities to give them to become leaders, to want to stay, and I think it'll be better for all of us.
Yeah, I think the traditional expat package, and by the way, I loved them when I was on them. They were absolutely fantastic. It was 20 years of that. But it was back in the original days when places like Prague were considered hardship, and so you get hardship allowances for things like that. And you're nuts. But so a lot of that's gone away. But I think there is still a place for it, like even at some up. But it's very specific to a very specific project. We've got one now where we got involved with the leadership team in terms of moving some technology skill sets to a certain country because we needed that country to be adapted for all the products for the regulatory reasons, and we didn't have it there. The problem was beware what you wish for, in that once we got that approved, it was like, yes, we're gonna do this. Global mobility became part of that decision-making process, except we didn't have the employment contract ready, we didn't have any of the policies ready, we didn't have any of the visa support ready, we didn't have the international schools ready, we didn't have any of that ready. And so it became something that we then had to obviously try and scramble to fix. But there is very, very small usage of that still today. I think where a lot of the benefit is coming in, where you can do things on a very low budget, is a lot of the self-driven moves, where you do have offices in places like Barcelona or Berlin or London or wherever, and somebody has a legitimate reason for wanting to go there, is a very useful way at very little cost. You say, I'm not helping you, but if you have the right to work there, we have a desk, we'll make sure you have your computer, we'll make sure you have everything you need. Good luck. We don't spend a whole lot of money on it, but the benefit of that to the individual is huge, and it doesn't cost a lot. And I think that's where you'll see a lot of companies trying to provide whatever support they possibly can.
Yeah. Back in my days as an intern, I would have loved to even get a little portion of the expat package. So I love the redistribution. But yeah, as promised, wanted to open it to the audience. Now you have the experts in front of you. What do you want to ask them?
You were talking about how global mobility is kind of a misfit, and I think we talked about this in our last panel when we were together, and I also talked to some people about that today. How do we find a home for global mobility within an organization, and what could that look like?
It was funny. I don't have a good answer to that one, unfortunately. I wish I did. And I can't remember if it was Localized who did this. There was an exercise we did where we said, all right, word salad, let's just type in where we all fit within our organizations. And it was like this massive everything. It was everything under the sun. And so I'm not sure we're ever going to solve that. The best I've ever seen is where it becomes its own unique function as opposed to being tied into anything. And how you do that is extremely difficult. It has to be a bigger organization. It tends to be the bigger corporates that do this, where it's positioned outside of everything else. Maybe sometimes it falls under legal, but it's generally driven by a senior executive or somebody at a certain level. But it tends to be really big corporations with a lot of moves that are the ones who are going to do that. Otherwise, I don't actually see an answer to that. I wish I did.
And I'm going to take a different tack and say, embrace it. We're not misfits, we're unique. And you've relocated and lived and worked in other countries. Don has, I have. You get that question sometimes, where are you from or where is home? And I've heard a lot of different answers, but home is where I feel like I belong right now, or where my family is, or where my connections are. Global mobility, I think, is the same way, right? We may never have the perfect spot in a corporate structure, especially in a smaller company, but we can make our space, and we can, I think, I'm a big fan of showing your work. I mentioned before, tell your story. Rob mentioned earlier, he doesn't want to hear about problems. Not everyone wants to see it, but to the people that want to see and understand what's going on, right? Some just want things to run smoothly, don't bother me. But show them what you're doing. Show them your work, the work of your teams. It's not about promoting you, but yourself, your partners. We're doing this, this, and this so that these things can happen. This is who we are. Define it. Own it. Embrace it. This is who we are. We'll tell you who we are and how we work. Yeah?
Thank you.
One thing to add from my side, and rather what I've seen from investors, from anyone around, also other founders, it's quite binary. Either they have had any touch point with global mobility, have relocated themselves, or so then they have an understanding, they really recognize it, or you go to the other side where it's I don't see, why is it an issue? And you're yeah, you clearly never tried to get a visa or move somewhere. Which also from an investor perspective, a lot of investors were yeah, what you do, it doesn't make sense, there's no market for it. And I'm but it is a bit binary, and I think that's the sad part. So trying to see, do you have anyone in the organization high up who does get it? But yeah, that's a sad part for me.
Let's assume we do this, that it's an own thing. How would you measure success? Because if you own your space in the organization and you're not dependent from people teams or talent teams, how would you measure success, and maybe without transactional KPIs like cost saving? Yeah, more value creation KPIs.
I think you have to visualize it, right? That's a term we use. What do I want to have happen, or what does the business want to have happen that I'm supporting, and not KPIs so much as the right person in the right place, or someone ready to take over this role, or a successful headquarters relocation. What does it look like? Is it partly numbers? Is it partly the feeling and the engagement? Is it partly, like I said, a lot of times for me, it's individual stories that someone went on this path, opened a new market, became a global leader. Great for them, great for the company. So I think visualize it. What do you want to have happen? What does the business want to have happen? How do we talk about that? There's been a lot of talk about measuring ROI in global mobility. I don't think anyone does it perfectly yet. And again, I've kind of gotten away from that given the role I'm in now and the small size. I don't have a data sample, but I can look at projects like even closing down a market. There are ways to do it that are as respectful as possible to the people involved and give as many people opportunities as possible versus just let's cut our losses and clear out and good luck to you. To me, that's what success looks like when we've had to say, we're leaving this market. So define it, work with the business, see what it looks like, and then do share when it is successful. And of course, when it's not, everyone hears, but tell them how you managed the challenges and what you learned and what you'll do next time better.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think you can get stuck in measuring things like tickets that you've answered or how many visa renewals and all of that. I think what the business is going to be interested in, what C-suite's interested in, are kind of two things: growth, and how do you support that, or cost reduction, how do you support that? It's one of those two things. And the India example that I used before is one of those that was real cost reduction. Another cost reduction is we got rid of, for example, all fast track, and just said, nope, we're not doing it globally. It was at Wayfair, it was millions that we were literally spending because of the size of the population, particularly in the United States. And for what gain were you really getting? You really need, if you could shape your processes better, and you set expectations with talent acquisition, you set those kind of things, that there's a success, there's a number that you can get from that, and it means something to the C-suite. On the growth side, it is how fast can you get a project up and running if you need to move people to another country. If it takes you 6 months to a year to get that started, well, that's more problematic than something, hey, I was able to set this in place, I had redundant visa suppliers, or I had whatever I needed in place to be able to say that growth started within 3 months because we were able to get the people there we needed, and you were able to then operate going forward. So it's really trying to attach to those kind of measurements that the business itself is interested in. The day-to-day metrics that we typically all spout out, they're useful for us because to run on a regular basis, but they're not something that's going to get a lot of attention.
Any last question?
Hello, I have a comment and a question to make. Earlier we were talking about welcoming culture, and I think it's very important and very much needed. However, I believe companies should also take accountability of what comes afterwards. So, fostering and nurturing a culture where the people we move for the job are also willing to stay, and they feel like they want to continue their life eventually in that country. So I was wondering, what are your companies doing about that?
I can give an example from past, actually. A company that I worked with was a software company, and they relocated people a lot of project-based work, and they wanted to connect people to each other, and this was before a lot of the apps and things out there existed. They created an internal social network for people who'd relocated to share and talk about healthcare, schools, so on and so forth. They did not manage it. I believe they monitored it just to be sure that there was nothing inappropriate. It was a company sponsored, but it was a very low cost, low time commitment for global mobility, and it was very successful with their team members. You don't always know, who else is relocated, who else is in the same kind of situation. It gave them a whole community that they could, share and learn from. I think that's huge. And to the other part of your question, how does this relocation matter, right? Again, career paths and talent planning, and how does this keep having those conversations with the HR team, with your people leadership, whoever it is that you need to be talking to say, don't just let us move these people, do all that work, and then you forget them. Take advantage of what they've learned in their unique perspectives, and continue to tell other people about that, and that will be a draw and a persuasion to more people to do the same thing. So it's a constant thing to remind people, get busy in the day-to-day, but say, wow, please remember to focus on this.
Yeah, I'd second that as well. I think, in sum up, Angela and the team have come up with the idea of relocation buddies. How do you add, exactly this, where you attach somebody who's done it before to someone who's relatively new to give them that kind of experience. That's helpful. I think I'm blessed with the fact that this is the one area where benefits does come into play, is that there's a lot more touch points once somebody's on board on the benefits side that allow us to then have those kind of conversations, seeing how people are progressing. I do think, and we talked about this in some of the prep, was we don't do as good a job from a mobility point with internal mobility, internal development. And I think there's an area that could be a lot better served by global mobility getting involved in that, along with the strategic or the people development teams. And I think there's an area that all of us could probably improve at and be supportive of that will help, I think, a lot of that, the issues of people just being brought in and then being left on their own forever. And good luck type of.
Thank you so much. Also, thanks for the questions from the audience. We are at the end of our official content, but we still have 2 hours for networking. We have the space until 7 p.m. There's some drinks, and I think also something to nibble. But before we dive into that, big applause for my panel, which I think was amazing.